The silence stretched across the briefing room like a taut wire ready to snap. 23 battle-hardened Navy SEALs sat frozen in their chairs, their cocky grins wiped clean as chalk dust from a blackboard. The woman at the front of the room hadn't moved for nearly 30 seconds, her hand still gripping the laser pointer, her eyes fixed on a satellite image that would haunt every man in that room for the rest of their lives. What they had just witnessed defied everything they thought they knew about warfare, about courage, and about the pilot they had spent the last 3 weeks dismissing as just another diversity hire. Lieutenant Commander Kestrel Phantom Voss stood 5'4" in her flight boots, with calloused hands that told stories of 10,000 flight hours and auburn hair pulled back so tight it could cut glass. To the SEALs, she had been nothing more than a curiosity, a female pilot assigned to their joint task force, someone to be tolerated rather than respected. They had made their jokes in the mess hall, whispered their doubts in the corridors, and treated her mission briefings like mandatory attendance at a lecture they'd rather skip. But now, staring at the aftermath captured in stark black and white on the projection screen, they realized they had been sharing barracks with a ghost. The photograph showed the twisted wreckage of 6 Taliban vehicles scattered across a mountain pass like discarded toys. Smoke still rose from the carnage in ghostly spirals, and among the debris, rescue teams could be seen extracting the 8 American hostages who had been presumed dead just hours earlier. The metadata timestamp in the corner read 3:47 hours, the exact moment when Phantom had pulled off what military historians would later call the most precise close air support mission in the history of special operations. But the SEALs didn't know that part yet. All they knew was that somehow, impossibly, their by-the-book paper pusher had just saved 8 American lives while threading the needle between precision and catastrophe with surgical accuracy that shouldn't have been humanly possible. The woman they had dismissed as just another academy graduate playing soldier had just redefined what it meant for air support to have your back. Commander Jake Apex Morrison, the SEAL team leader who had been most vocal about his doubts regarding female pilots in combat zones, felt his throat constrict as he stared at the image. His fingers drummed against the metal folding chair, a nervous habit he thought he had conquered years ago in Bud-S training. Somewhere in the back of his mind, a voice whispered that he had been catastrophically wrong about Lieutenant Commander Voss. The question now was whether his pride would let him admit it. The aircraft hangar at Forward Operating Base Sentinel buzzed with the controlled chaos of a military operation in full swing. Mechanics swarmed over a damaged Apache helicopter, their tools singing metallic lullabies against armored plating, while fuel trucks rumbled past like mechanical beasts. But in the far corner, away from the noise and diesel fumes, sat something that didn't belong in this theater of war. A pristine FA-18E Super Hornet bearing the call sign, Phantom, in bold black letters across its nose. The jet's gray-blue camouflage paint scheme made it nearly invisible against the dawn sky, but up close, its presence commanded attention like a sleeping predator. Twin General Electric F414 engines gleamed under the hangar lights, each one capable of producing 22,000 pounds of thrust, enough to push 44,000 pounds of aircraft and ordnance through the sound barrier like it was standing still. The radar-absorbing coating gave the fighter an almost ethereal quality, as if it existed somewhere between the physical world and the realm of shadows. Phantom stood beneath her aircraft's starboard wing, running her pre-flight inspection with the methodical precision of a surgeon preparing for a heart transplant. Her flight suit bore the patches of a dozen different squadrons, each one representing a deployment where she had earned her reputation one mission at a time. The largest patch, positioned over her left breast pocket, showed the distinctive skull and crossbones of VFA 103, the Jolly Rogers, a squadron with a combat history stretching back to World War II. "You know they're watching you, right?" The voice belonged to Captain Marcus Diesel Rodriguez, her crew chief and the closest thing she had to a friend in this testosterone-soaked outpost. Rodriguez had been maintaining Navy aircraft for 15 years, and he could read pilots like sheet music. He knew when they were nervous, when they were angry, and when they were carrying something heavier than their aircraft's maximum payload. Phantom didn't look up from her inspection checklist. "Let them watch," she replied, her voice carrying the flat tone of someone who had long ago stopped caring about other people's opinions. "Maybe they'll learn something." Rodriguez chuckled and shook his head. He had served with enough pilots to recognize the difference between bravado and genuine confidence. Phantom possessed the latter in abundance, mixed with something else, a quiet intensity that reminded him of a coiled spring. He had seen her fly, had watched her thread her Super Hornet through mountain valleys at 500 knots like she was born with wings instead of arms. But he had also seen the way the other aviators treated her, the subtle exclusions and casual dismissals that accumulated like grains of sand in an hourglass. The morning briefing had been particularly brutal. When Phantom presented her tactical assessment of the hostage situation, suggesting a low-altitude approach through a narrow canyon system, the room had erupted in barely concealed laughter. Commander Morrison had actually rolled his eyes before asking if she was sure she wouldn't prefer a safer mission profile. The implication hung in the air like cordite, that she was too cautious, too afraid, too female for the kind of precision flying required to save American lives. The irony would have been funny if it weren't so tragic. They had no idea that Phantom had cut her teeth flying combat air patrols over Mosul, or that she held the squadron record for the most danger-close missions completed without a single friendly fire incident. They saw her gender first, her rank second, and her capabilities not at all. It was a blindness that might cost lives, both theirs and the hostages they were supposed to rescue. The morning sun painted the Afghan mountains in shades of gold and crimson, transforming the harsh landscape into something almost beautiful. From the cockpit of her Super Hornet, 30,000 feet above the peaks, Phantom could see the entire theater of operations spread out below her like a three-dimensional chessboard. The Taliban convoy was a line of black dots moving through a valley floor, their dust trail marking their progress toward the Pakistani border. Intelligence estimated they had 6 hours before the hostages disappeared forever into the tribal regions, where even satellite surveillance couldn't reach. "Ghost Rider, this is Phantom. I have visual on the package. 8 vehicles in convoy formation, proceeding east through Grid Square Romeo 7. Her voice carried clearly through the radio static, professional and unhurried despite the weight of the moment. In the SEAL team's command post 15 miles away, 23 men leaned forward in their chairs, suddenly very interested in what the woman they had dismissed was about to do. The tactical situation was a nightmare wrapped in Murphy's Law and tied with razor wire. The hostages were being transported in the middle vehicles of the convoy, surrounded by Taliban fighters armed with heavy machine guns and shoulder-fired missiles. Any conventional attack would result in civilian casualties, an outcome that would make the rescue mission a strategic failure regardless of its tactical success. The canyon system Phantom had identified during the morning briefing was their only option, but it required flying through a gap barely wider than her aircraft's wingspan at speeds that would make reaction time measured in milliseconds rather than seconds. Commander Morrison's voice crackled through her headset, heavy with skepticism and barely concealed anxiety. "Phantom, are you certain about this approach vector? We've got other options we can explore if you're having second thoughts." The condescension in his tone was subtle but unmistakable, the kind of verbal pat on the head that suggested he was offering her an honorable way to back down from a mission that real pilots, male pilots, should handle. Phantom's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, but her voice remained steady. "Negative, Ghost Rider. This is the only way to achieve mission success without casualties. Beginning descent now." She pushed the stick forward and felt her stomach lift as the Super Hornet dropped toward the mountains like a stone with wings. The altimeter spun backward through 25,000 feet, 20,000, 15,000. The mountain peaks rose around her like the walls of a canyon, and for a moment she was flying through a landscape that existed somewhere between earth and sky, where the thin air and brutal geography demanded perfection from both pilot and machine. The radio chatter from the SEAL team's overwatch position grew more frequent as they tracked her descent, their professional calm beginning to crack around the edges. They could see what she was attempting, and the mathematics of it made their blood run cold. At the speed required to avoid surface-to-air missiles, she would have exactly 1.7 seconds to identify her targets, line up her weapon systems, and deliver ordnance with surgical precision. 1 degree off course would send her crashing into a mountain wall. 1 second of hesitation would result in dead hostages. But Phantom had been preparing for this moment her entire career. Every training flight, every simulation, every night spent studying tactical manuals had led to this valley, this mission, this chance to prove that courage had nothing to do with chromosomes and everything to do with the willingness to fly into hell when American lives hung in the balance. The canyon walls closed around Phantom's Super Hornet like the jaws of some prehistoric beast, leaving barely 10 feet of clearance on either wingtip. At 400 knots, the margin for error had shrunk to nothing. A single gust of wind or momentary lapse in concentration would paint her aircraft across the limestone cliffs in a pattern of twisted metal and burning fuel. But her hands remained steady on the controls, and her breathing maintained the controlled rhythm she had learned during countless hours of meditation and mental preparation. "Jesus Christ," whispered Sergeant Tommy Brick Kowalski from his overwatch position 3 miles away. He was tracking Phantom's progress through high-powered binoculars, and what he saw defied both physics and common sense. The gray-blue fighter was threading through mountain passes at impossible speeds, sometimes inverted, sometimes so low that its exhaust wash kicked up dust clouds from the valley floor. Kowalski had served 3 tours with some of the best aviators in the Navy, but he had never seen flying like this. The Taliban convoy had stopped in a natural choke point, probably hopping to wait out what they assumed was routine reconnaissance. Their fighters had deployed in defensive positions among the rocks, their AK-47s and RPGs pointed skyward in futile gestures of defiance. They had no idea that death was approaching them at the speed of sound, guided by systems so advanced they could distinguish between friend and foe from miles away. Phantom's heads-up display showed the tactical picture with crystalline clarity. 8 vehicles arranged in a defensive formation, with the hostages confirmed in vehicles 3 and 5. Her targeting computer had already calculated attack vectors for the escort vehicles while ensuring 0 probability of collateral damage to the Americans. The weapons payload she carried, 4 AGM-114 Hellfire missiles and a full load of 20 cannon rounds, was precisely what she needed to complete the mission, but only if she could deliver them with accuracy measured in inches rather than feet. "Ghost Rider, this is Phantom. Beginning attack run. All units maintain radio silence until completion." Her voice carried an authority that cut through the static and the doubt, transforming her from the woman they had questioned into the pilot who held 8 American lives in her hands. In the command post, Commander Morrison found himself holding his breath despite 20 years of combat experience that should have taught him better. The first Hellfire missile left its rail at exactly 0346-47, guided by a laser designation system that painted the lead Taliban vehicle with invisible light. The explosion, when it came, was precise and devastating, a surgical strike that eliminated the convoy's heavy weapons while leaving the hostage vehicles untouched. The second missile followed 3 seconds later, removing the rear guard vehicle and cutting off any possibility of retreat. By the time the Taliban fighters realized they were under attack, Phantom was already lining up her cannon run on the remaining threats. The 20 Vulcan cannon spat death at 6,000 rounds per minute, its depleted uranium shells chewing through armored vehicles like a chainsaw through balsa wood. But what made the attack remarkable wasn't its destructiveness. It was its restraint. Every burst was precisely controlled, every target carefully selected to eliminate threats, while preserving the lives of the 8 Americans who had been given up for dead just hours earlier. When the smoke cleared and the rescue helicopters moved in, they found the hostages shaken but unharmed, surrounded by the surgical destruction of their captors. The silence in the SEAL Team Command post stretched on for nearly a minute after Phantom's final radio transmission confirmed mission success. 23 men who had built their careers on brotherhood, precision, and unwavering confidence sat staring at their tactical displays, with expressions ranging from shock to something approaching awe. The woman they had dismissed as just another politically correct appointment had just executed the most precise close air support mission any of them had ever witnessed. Commander Morrison was the first to break the silence, his voice carrying none of its earlier condescension. "Phantom, this is Ghost Rider. Outstanding work. Recovery teams are en route to extract the packages." The words felt inadequate, like trying to describe a symphony with a vocabulary limited to single notes. What he had just watched transcended standard military operations and entered the realm of artistry, deadly, beautiful, and executed with a perfection that would be dissected in war colleges for decades to come. Sergeant Kowalski lowered his binoculars and shook his head slowly. "I've been doing this for 12 years, he said to no one in particular, "and I've never seen anything like that." She threaded that canyon like she was born to fly it. The admission carried weight coming from Kowalski, whose reputation for straight talk was legendary throughout the special operations community. When Brick said something was impressive, people listened. Staff Sergeant Alina Frost Vasquez, the team's communications specialist, was reviewing the radio traffic logs with professional fascination. "Look at this," she said, pointing to her screen. "Total radio silence for the entire attack run. No requests for guidance, no status updates, no nothing. She flew that whole mission solo, made every tactical decision in real time, and pulled it off without missing a beat." The technical achievement was staggering. Most pilots would have maintained constant communication with ground control, seeking reassurance and guidance throughout such a complex operation. But what impressed the SEALs more than the technical flying was the tactical intelligence Phantom had demonstrated. Her approach vector had been calculated to maximize surprise while minimizing risk to the hostages. Her weapons selection and employment had shown an understanding of battlefield dynamics that usually took years of combat experience to develop. Every decision she made had been the right one, executed at the right moment with perfect timing. The psychological impact of witnessing such competence was profound. These were men who had spent their careers working with the military's elite, Marine Force recon operators, Delta Force commandos, Air Force pararescue jumpers, and they recognized excellence when they saw it. What they had just witnessed from Lieutenant Commander Voss was excellence of the highest order, the kind that separated legends from footnotes in military history. As the rescue helicopters confirmed successful extraction of all 8 hostages, the SEALs began to understand that they had been sharing their forward operating base with something rare and precious, a warrior in the truest sense of the word. Gender had nothing to do with it. Politics had nothing to do with it. What mattered was the willingness to fly into harm's way when American lives hung in the balance, and the skill to bring everyone home alive. The transformation in the team's attitude was immediate and profound, like watching ice melt in desert heat. Phantom's Super Hornet touched down on FOB Sentinel's runway with the gentle precision of a butterfly landing on a flower petal. The reversers engaged with a throaty roar that echoed off the mountains, but even that sound seemed subdued, as if the aircraft itself understood the gravity of what had just transpired. Ground crews rushed to meet the fighter as it taxied toward the hangar, their movements carrying an urgency that had nothing to do with standard procedures and everything to do with witnessing history in the making. In the cockpit, Phantom began her post-flight procedures with the same methodical precision she brought to every aspect of her flying. Throttles to idle, weapons systems safe, radar to standby. Each switch and lever moved with practiced efficiency, but her hands betrayed none of the adrenaline that still coursed through her system. The mission had lasted exactly 17 minutes from initial contact to final confirmation of hostage recovery. But those 17 minutes had contained enough stress and split-second decisions to age most pilots by years. Captain Rodriguez was waiting beside the aircraft as the canopy opened, his weathered face split by a grin that could have been seen from orbit. "Ma'am," he said, his voice carrying a reverence usually reserved for religious experiences, "that was the most beautiful piece of flying I've ever had the privilege to witness." Rodriguez had maintained aircraft for some of the Navy's most decorated aviators, but he had never seen anything that approached Phantom's performance in the canyon. The news of the successful rescue had already spread throughout the base with the speed of wildfire in drought season. Personnel who had never paid attention to the quiet female pilot were suddenly finding reasons to walk past the hangar, hopping to catch a glimpse of the woman who had just pulled off the impossible. The base commander, Colonel Marcus "Hawk" Patterson, was reportedly cutting short a video conference with Pentagon officials to personally debrief the mission. But perhaps the most significant change was occurring in the SEAL team's compound, where Commander Morrison was facing the uncomfortable reality of his own prejudices. The mission's success had forced him to confront assumptions he hadn't even realized he held, beliefs about women in combat that had been shaped more by cultural conditioning than by actual experience or evidence. Watching Phantom's tactical brilliance unfold in real time had been like having scales fall from his eyes. "Sir," said Sergeant Kowalski, approaching Morrison with the hesitant manner of a man about to challenge his commanding officer, "I think we owe Lieutenant Commander Voss an apology. Several apologies, actually." The admission carried weight coming from Kowalski, whose opinions were respected throughout the team. When Brick said something needed to be done, it usually got done without argument. Morrison nodded slowly, his jaw working as he processed emotions he wasn't entirely comfortable with. Pride warred with humility, professional respect battled with personal embarrassment. "You're right, Sergeant, we all are." The words came hard, like pulling splinters from a wound, but they needed to be said. "Set up a team meeting for 1400 hours. It's time we had a conversation about what we just witnessed." The afternoon sun slanted through the hangar's open doors, casting long shadows across the concrete floor, where Phantom stood briefing the base intelligence officer on her observations during the rescue mission. Her flight suit was still damp with sweat, and her hair showed the telltale indentations of a helmet worn under extreme stress. But her voice remained clear and professional as she described the tactical situation with the precision of a surgeon documenting an operation. The debriefing revealed details that made the mission's success even more remarkable. The canyon system she had navigated was known to local pilots as the Graveyard, due to its history of claiming aircraft and crews who attempted to fly through it at anything approaching combat speeds. The weather conditions had included crosswinds gusting up to 30 knots, enough to throw even experienced pilots off course. The Taliban fighters had been better armed than intelligence had suggested, with several carrying modern surface-to-air missiles that could have ended the mission in a ball of flame and twisted metal. The key was treating it like a precision instrument approach, Phantom explained to the gathering crowd of pilots and ground personnel. You establish your parameters, trust your training, and execute with absolute commitment. Hesitation gets people killed. The simplicity of her explanation belied the extraordinary skill required to translate theory into practice while flying through a geographical nightmare at speeds that compressed decision-making into microseconds. What emerged from the technical discussion was a portrait of a pilot who had spent years preparing for exactly this type of mission. Phantom's training records, when finally examined by her peers, revealed a pattern of seeking out the most challenging assignments, the most dangerous flying conditions, the scenarios that other aviators avoided. She had voluntarily flown training missions in weather that grounded more experienced pilots, practiced approaches that tested the limits of both human reflexes and aircraft capabilities. Lieutenant Colonel Sarah Viper Chen, the base's senior female pilot and a veteran of 3 combat deployments, found herself looking at Phantom with new eyes. "I've been flying for 15 years," she said quietly, "and I'm not sure I could have made that approach work. Hell, I'm not sure I would have even attempted it." The admission carried weight coming from Chen, whose own reputation as a stick-and-rudder pilot was formidable. But perhaps the most telling moment came when Master Chief Petty Officer Robert Anchor Williams, the senior enlisted advisor for the entire Special Operations Task Force, approached Phantom after the formal debriefing. Williams was a 30-year veteran who had served with 3 different SEAL teams and earned a reputation for blunt honesty that made admirals uncomfortable. When he spoke, people listened, especially when he was discussing matters of courage and competence. "Ma'am," Williams said, his voice carrying the gravitas of 3 decades in uniform, "I've served with a lot of warriors in my time, seen men do things that defied description under fire, but what you did today," he paused, searching for words adequate to the moment, "that was the finest display of combat aviation I've ever witnessed. You brought 8 Americans home when nobody else thought it was possible. That's what we're here for. That's why we wear the uniform." The words hung in the hangar air like incense, sanctifying a moment that would be remembered long after the war was over and the bases were abandoned to the mountain winds. The SEAL team meeting convened at exactly 1400 hours in a concrete-walled briefing room that smelled of coffee, gun oil, and the peculiar mixture of sweat and determination that accumulated around special operations personnel. Commander Morrison stood at the front of the room, his hands clasped behind his back in a posture that spoke of formal occasions and uncomfortable truths. 22 of his men filled folding chairs arranged in precise military rows, their faces reflecting various degrees of curiosity, anticipation, and dawning realization about what their commanding officer was about to say. "Gentlemen," Morrison began, his voice carrying the weight of hard-earned wisdom, "we need to have a conversation about Lieutenant Commander Voss and the assumptions we've been making about her capabilities." The words felt strange in his mouth, like speaking a foreign language he was still learning to pronounce. "This morning's mission results have made it clear that our assessment of her qualifications was not just wrong, it was dangerously wrong." The silence that followed was thick enough to cut with a Ka-Bar knife. These were men who had built their careers on accurate threat assessment and tactical intelligence, yet they had collectively failed to recognize the exceptional pilot who had been living among them for 3 weeks. The cognitive dissonance was uncomfortable, like wearing body armor that didn't quite fit. Sergeant First Class Michael Tank Thompson, the team's heavy weapons specialist, shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "Sir," he said, his voice carefully modulated, "are we talking about a formal acknowledgement of our misjudgment?" The question carried implications that extended beyond simple military courtesy. In the special operations community, reputation and respect were currencies more valuable than combat pay, and the team's treatment of Phantom had reflected poorly on their professional judgment. "We're talking about the fact that we let our preconceptions cloud our evaluation of a fellow warrior," Morrison replied, his tone growing sharper. "We made assumptions based on factors that have nothing to do with combat effectiveness, and those assumptions nearly blinded us to working with one of the finest pilots any of us will ever encounter." The admission hurt like swallowing broken glass, but it needed to be said. Staff Sergeant David Reaper Jackson, the team's sniper and a man known for his ability to read people with the same precision he applied to long-range targets, nodded slowly. "I've been thinking about this since the debrief," he said. "The woman we've been sharing mess hall jokes about just pulled off a mission that will be studied in war colleges for the next 50 years. That kind of flying doesn't happen by accident. It's the result of years of preparation and dedication." The conversation that followed was unlike any team meeting Morrison had conducted in 20 years of leadership. His men, warriors who prided themselves on brotherhood and mutual respect, were confronting their own capacity for bias and prejudice. The discussion was raw, honest, and occasionally painful as each operator examined his own behavior and found it wanting. Petty Officer First Class Louis Ghost Morales, the team's intelligence specialist, pulled up Phantom's service record on his tablet and began reading statistics that painted a picture of sustained excellence. 4 combat deployments, 847 flight hours in theater, 0 friendly fire incidents, and a 94% mission success rate. She's been awarded the Distinguished Flying Cross twice and the Air Medal 6 times. These numbers don't lie. We do. The statistical recitation was followed by testimonials from other units that had worked with Phantom during previous deployments. Marine infantry officers praised her close air support work during urban combat operations. Army Special Forces teams credited her with saving lives during extraction missions gone wrong. Air Force rescue coordinators described her as the pilot they requested by name when American lives hung in the balance. By the end of the meeting, the transformation in the team's perspective was complete and irreversible. They had entered the briefing room as men who had casually dismissed a female pilot as a diversity hire. They left as warriors who understood they had been sharing their forward operating base with a legend in the making. Evening settled over forward operating base Sentinel like a blanket woven from purple shadows and golden light, transforming the harsh military installation into something almost beautiful. The mountains that surrounded the base glowed with alpenglow, their peaks catching the last rays of sunlight, while their valleys filled with darkness that seemed to rise from the earth like smoke. In this liminal hour between day and night, when the desert temperature began its precipitous drop toward freezing, the base took on a contemplative quality that encouraged reflection and quiet conversation. Phantom sat alone in the pilot's lounge, a small room furnished with mismatched furniture salvaged from various military installations. She held a cup of coffee that had long since grown cold, her attention focused on a letter she was writing on personal stationery that bore the embossed insignia of the Naval Academy. The letter was addressed to her younger sister, a high school senior considering a military career, and the words came slowly as Phantom tried to capture the complexities of service life without crushing the dreams that had once sustained her through her own dark moments of doubt. The sound of boots on concrete announced the arrival of visitors before they knocked on the door frame with the courtesy that military protocol demanded. Commander Morrison stood in the doorway, flanked by Sergeant Kowalski and Staff Sergeant Jackson, their faces reflecting a mixture of determination and uncertainty that suggested this was not a routine social call. Behind them, barely visible in the corridor shadows, stood the rest of the SEAL team, men who had come to bear witness to a moment that would define their unit's character for years to come. "Lieutenant Commander," Morrison said, his voice carrying formal respect that hadn't been present in their previous interactions, "we were hoping we could speak with you for a moment." The request was phrased as a courtesy, but the tension in his posture suggested that what he had to say was important enough to risk personal embarrassment. Phantom looked up from her letter, her expression carefully neutral but her eyes showing a wariness born of 3 weeks of casual dismissal and professional isolation. "Of course, Commander. Please come in." She gestured toward the available seating, but Morrison remained standing, his hands clasped behind his back in the formal position that military officers adopted when delivering speeches they had rehearsed but hoped never to give. "Ma'am," Morrison began, then stopped, cleared his throat, and tried again. "Lieutenant Commander Voss, my team and I owe you an apology, a significant apology." The words came slowly, like pulling teeth, but they carried the weight of genuine regret. "We made assumptions about your capabilities based on factors that had nothing to do with your qualifications or your service record. Those assumptions were not just wrong, they were unprofessional and unworthy of the uniform." The silence that followed stretched for several heartbeats, while Phantom studied the faces of the men who had spent 3 weeks treating her like an unwelcome obligation. She could see genuine remorse in their expressions, but she could also see something else, a dawning recognition of her worth as a warrior that went beyond simple courtesy or political correctness. These were men who had built their careers on assessing talent and capability, and they were finally seeing her clearly for the first time. "I appreciate that, Commander," Phantom replied, her voice carrying neither warmth nor coldness, but rather the professional neutrality of someone who had learned to armor herself against disappointment. Apology accepted. The words were correct and proper, but they hung in the air like a question mark, suggesting that forgiveness was a more complex process than a simple exchange of words. Sergeant Kowalski stepped forward, his weathered face reflecting the kind of earnestness that made men follow him into combat. "Ma'am, if I may," he said, "what we witnessed today changed our understanding of what's possible. That flying you did, threading that canyon system at combat speed, making those precision strikes while preserving the hostages, that was the finest piece of combat aviation any of us have ever seen. We wanted you to know that we recognize what you accomplished, and we're honored to serve alongside you." The admission transformed the atmosphere in the small room, replacing formal military courtesy with something approaching genuine respect. These were men who understood excellence when they witnessed it, and they had finally seen past their own prejudices to recognize the exceptional warrior who had been living among them. The moment carried weight that extended beyond personal relationships to touch on fundamental questions of honor, service, and the bonds that held military units together in the crucible of combat. Phantom set down her coffee cup and stood, her movement deliberate and controlled. When she spoke, her voice carried a quality that hadn't been present in their previous interactions, not warmth exactly, but acknowledgement that something significant had shifted in the dynamic between them. "Thank you," she said simply. "That means more than you might realize." The conversation that followed lasted nearly 2 hours and covered territory that ranged from tactical analysis of the morning's mission to broader questions about the integration of women into combat roles. What emerged was a portrait of mutual respect between professionals who had finally moved beyond surface judgments to recognize each other's essential humanity and shared commitment to the mission. The SEAL team discovered that Phantom possessed not just exceptional flying skills, but also a tactical intelligence and strategic understanding that complemented their own expertise. She, in turn, began to see past their initial dismissiveness to recognize the professional competence and brotherhood that defined their unit. By the time the conversation concluded, the relationships within the forward operating base had fundamentally changed. The woman they had dismissed as a diversity hire had been revealed as one of the most capable combat aviators in the theater, while the men who had initially rejected her had proven capable of growth and recognition of their own limitations. It was a transformation that spoke to the possibility of redemption and the power of shared purpose to overcome even deeply ingrained prejudices. The stars over Afghanistan burned with crystalline clarity in the thin mountain air, creating a celestial canopy that had witnessed countless human dramas play out in the valleys below. Phantom stood on the observation deck of the base's control tower, her flight jacket zipped against the desert cold, watching the distant lights of villages scattered across the landscape like fallen stars. The altitude gave her a perspective that transformed the harsh geography into something approaching beauty, and the silence allowed her thoughts to process the day's events without the constant noise of military operations. 2 weeks had passed since the hostage rescue mission, and the transformation in her relationship with the SEAL team had evolved from formal respect to genuine professional partnership. The change hadn't happened overnight. Trust earned in combat was different from trust granted in briefing rooms, but each shared operation had strengthened the bonds between them until she was no longer an outsider tolerated by necessity, but a valued member of the team whose opinion carried weight in tactical planning sessions. The mission that had changed everything was being studied at multiple levels of command, from theater headquarters to the Pentagon itself. Military analysts were dissecting her approach vector, her weapons employment, and her decision-making process under extreme stress. The tactical innovation she had demonstrated, using terrain masking and precision timing to achieve tactical surprise while minimizing civilian casualties, was being incorporated into training programs for pilots throughout the Navy and Air Force. But the personal transformation was perhaps more significant than the professional recognition. The SEAL team had evolved from skeptical colleagues to protective brothers, men who now spoke of her with the same pride they reserved for their own unit members. When other personnel made casual comments about women in combat, they found themselves facing the collective displeasure of 23 Special Operations veterans who had witnessed capability that transcended gender politics. "Figured I'd find you up here," said a familiar voice from the stairway. Commander Morrison emerged onto the observation deck, carrying 2 cups of what passed for coffee in military installations. The steam from the hot liquid created small clouds in the cold air, and his breath formed similar puffs as he spoke. "Mind if I join you?" Phantom accepted the offered coffee with a nod of gratitude. Their relationship had evolved considerably since that first awkward apology, developing into something approaching friendship based on mutual respect and shared experience. Morrison had proven capable of significant personal growth, transforming from a skeptical commander focused on gender politics to a professional partner who valued her tactical insights and flying expertise. "I got word from Colonel Patterson today," Morrison said, his tone carrying news that could be either positive or problematic. "Pentagon brass wants a full debrief on the hostage rescue mission. Face-to-face meetings, formal presentations, the full dog and pony show." He paused, studying her expression in the starlight. "They're talking about using your tactical approach as a case study for integrated special operations. Apparently, what you pulled off that morning is being called a paradigm shift in close air support doctrine." The news should have felt like vindication, but Phantom found herself experiencing a complex mixture of pride and wariness. Recognition from senior leadership was professionally valuable, but it also carried the risk of being transformed from a working pilot into a poster child for women in combat. The distinction mattered. Poster children gave speeches and posed for photographs, while working pilots flew missions and saved lives. "Any idea what kind of timeline they're looking at?" she asked, her voice carefully neutral. The question contained multiple layers of meaning. When would she be required to leave her current assignment? How long would she be trapped in briefing rooms instead of cockpits? Would this recognition help or hinder her ability to continue doing the job she loved? Morrison understood the subtext behind her question. 6 weeks, maybe 8. Long enough to finish our current rotation and transition your replacement. He took a sip of coffee and grimaced at the taste. "For what it's worth, I put in my recommendation that any dog and pony show appearances be kept to a minimum. You're too valuable as an operational asset to waste on publicity tour." The conversation drifted toward broader,